On Life and Meaning is brought to you by Blumenthal Performing Arts, celebrating its 25th year presenting the best in the performing arts, sharing and employing the arts as a major catalyst to strengthen education, building community cohesiveness, and advancing economic growth. Further support is provided by Foundation for the Carolinas, inspiring philanthropy and empowering individuals to create a better community. And by the Arts and Science Council, Charlotte-Mecklenburg's resource hub and lead advocate for the regional cultural community, providing culture for all.
Because both sides of the family were kind of romantic in terms of their engagement with California, that's the world in which I grew up. And that it was always this golden and beautiful landscape that was choked with opportunity for everybody who was moving westward, whether it was in the 19th century or in the Dust Bowl decades. I was lucky that the California that I thought that I knew as a boy was eternally optimistic and filled with this kind of joyful beauty. I mean, that's really how I remember it. You're lucky if you're a kid, if that's the way you think of where you were raised. And, eventually I was raised in the desert. And so that's woven into me quite completely a great love for the desert landscape and the way of life and the fragility of the seasons and its awesome stillness. I mean, I miss it every day.
John Boyer is president and CEO of the Bechtler Museum of Modern Art, a museum dedicated to the exhibition of the Bechtler family collection of mid-20th century modern art. During his tenure, John has also served as curator of the museum, overseeing the design and installation of 20 different exhibitions, including shows on Alberto Giacometti, Niki de St. Phalle, and Mario Botta. Previously, John served as president and CEO of the Roosevelt Institute, a public policy agency, and as executive director of the Mark Twain House. He taught art history at Trinity College in Connecticut and lectured at Columbia and Brown universities. John is also the independent chair of the board of the Voya Mutual Funds family. In this episode, we explore leading a museum of modern art. What is modern art? What Mark Twain and modern art have in common, and art as a means to connect to a higher form of our lives. I'm Mark Paris, and this is On Life and Meaning. John, welcome.
Thank you.
John, how do you describe the Bechtler Museum of Modern Art?
Well, I would tell them that it's an institution dedicated to the best aspects of mid-20th century modernism as expressed in Europe, the UK, and the US, and embodied in the collection that was formed by the Bechtler family, predominantly in Zurich and the years after World War II, and then here as well in the United States.
What's important about the Bechtler?
One answer is always the art itself, right? It is the predicate upon which any aspect of our organization is based. And so the most important thing is the collection. And how we elect to interpret it, serve as stewards in perpetuity for it, to be responsible fiscal agents on the collection's behalf, to make sure that we create every opportunity we can to help everyone in this community whom we can reach well, shall we say, get to know the collection better and better, but most importantly, to make sure that the collection, the objects in it, provide moments of self-discovery for all of those individuals. And so that becomes, I think, the most important thing, and that is to say that the most important thing is the effect that the collection can have on each and every one of us, and that's what gives value to this larger enterprise. What's remarkable is that it's a collection formed by one family. And so it gains a measure of uniqueness that is really only found at places like the Frick in New York City or the de Menil collection in Houston, and really only a handful of others, the Broad in Los Angeles. where you have not only the artist's vision at work, but you have a sense of the collector's vision. And from that, you can extract many other very important stories about the very nature of collecting, how one decides to go in that direction, what the exchange is of time and emotional commitment, not only the financial, but if you're going to go down that road and be an art collector, it becomes part of your life. So that's one of the strengths of the institution that separates us from other wonderful organizations where the collections have been built over time from a wide variety of acquisition processes, buying at market, getting gifts. Ours is very focused in regards to its origins, which I think is one of its strengths.
John, I'm wondering if you might describe the collection, its extent, what one would encounter and experience in the collection.
The collection's around 1,500 pieces, and it's really all media. We only have a small number of photographs, so the vast majority of the works are painting, sculpture, decorative arts, and then works on paper. And those are prints, artist books, and other media, mixed media, shall we say. In this, you have a remarkable roster of mid-century artists, the ones who moved the game perhaps more than most. So it's both Alberto and Diego Giacometti, Andy Warhol, Jasper Johns, Roy Lichtenstein, Le Corbusier, Leger, Miro. I mean, it's a remarkable constellation of major contributors to the course of modernism in those years after World War II.
John, the museum is now 10 years old.
We're getting there, yes.
Where is it in its timeline as a mature institution?
That's a great question. I still consider us to be young. And measures of that youth, I think, are revealed by the size of our membership, which I believe is going to continue to grow. We're now at about 1,400 members, and I can see in just the next few years that number eventually doubling, especially with all of the younger professionals having the chance to now live uptown in close proximity to the museum. We're also young in that we were born in the middle of a global financial meltdown, as we all recall. I came here in March of 2008, and of course, by the end of that summer, we were fully in a global recession, and it had an immense impact on Charlotte, which is such a critically important financial hub. So part of our youth, I would say almost it's arrested financial development. Those first few years in particular, we've run on a very lean machine. We've tried to be exceptionally prudent in how we see ourselves acting in the community, how well we can serve. We didn't want to overreach because, at least in my estimation, there were far too many unknowns in the economy, and not just locally, but globally. And so part of that youth is a result of a budget that's only now beginning to blossom in a way that we had hoped we would have been in the beginning, but are certainly now.
How has that arrested development of the financial strength of the institution impacted its mission and what it does?
I think anybody in my position and any strong board will want to make sure that the strategic plan for an organization is appropriately balanced between being ambitious and being prudent. There's no point in imagining all kinds of extraordinary things if they drive you into the red. So we've tried to be very responsible. And in fact, we've been in the black every year, which actually is something that not every cultural institution can say, but we've been very concerned from the start about having a stronger and stronger balance sheet to be able to present ourselves as a smart small business to those folks who never really think of a museum in that way, but they should. And for all of those who want to provide support, who think of it as an investment of their treasure and time into an organization on behalf of the entire community. So for all of those reasons and more, staff retention, attracting good board members, we needed to be strong, even if small, in the beginning, and then to grow prudently over time, which we've been lucky enough to do.
If the Bechtler had greater resources, how would that show up?
Well, there are at least two things. That's one of the things I tell the staff. If somebody were to walk in the front door right now with $1 million check, they said, I'm going to give it to you if you can convince me how it's going to change the institution and do better things for the community. It's always worth knowing. So there are two things. The first is that we cannot keep up with the demand that is made of us for our community outreach programs. Tomorrow, we could be doing even more in the jail system than we are now. This last year, which just ended June 30, we had 10 different programs in the jail system, and we could double that based on the current demand. We can't afford to grow that quickly in that program without having the other community outreach programs sacrifice. And yet, there's increasing demand in those other community outreach programs. So whether it's our work with InReach or our early onset dementia program, or working with physicians and other healthcare providers to help increase their skills as diagnosticians on the one hand, but also to help prevent physician burnout on the other, our work with the low to no vision audience. So if somebody came in with a big check, the first thing I would do would be to invest more in our ability to meet those needs and even more audiences in town. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is that I would want to be able to invest more robustly in our research and publication capability. It's not only about exhibitions, as important as they are, but this is a collection that still has an awful lot of work to be done towards our understanding it in a granular way, piece by piece. And there's a whole world out there of museums and collectors and scholars, art historians and critics and others who don't know this collection well enough yet. And so that's where I would put a lot of our throw weight.
Would the visitor experience change at all?
I think it would, because we would be, the more we know about these works and the more that we know about their context, culturally, historically, biographically, technically, all those different ways, the better a job we can do in revealing the beauty and the mysteries and the complexities of all of these works. And that would show up, whether it's in expanded video access, more robust audio guides. Clearly, all of that research and writing would end up not only in print, but clearly in a digital world, which would be instantaneously globalized. So not only for those people who come to the museum, but for anybody who's considering any of the artists represented in the museum or the issues that some of our exhibitions try to deal with, you're talking about a much larger audience than just those who come to see the museum.
Many museums would spend their money expanding their collection. Is the collection static?
No, and the collection's never been static. So I'll give you one example. Before we even opened to the public, we were approached by a couple here in town, a retired professor at UNCC, who had received back in the 1960s 2 of the drawings produced by one of Jean Tinguely's drawing machines. And in fact, he got these with Tinguely right there running the machine, and Tinguely signed them on the back and dated them and gave them to the young fellow at that time. And so he wondered if we would be interested in having these for the collection, and we said, absolutely. So that's an example to reinforce the idea that the museum would be ready to receive works that relate to the core collection itself, by which I mean the artists who were best known and most loved by Hans and Bessie Bechtler, and also by Andreas Bechtler. And so we're really talking about that core catalog of the most influential artists during that span from the late 1940s up to about 1980. And so we would receive those. We do not have an acquisitions budget. So the question there would be, for a young organization like ours, emerging out of a global financial meltdown, in a town that had not had that much of a track record with mid-20th century European modernism to begin with, I've always felt that it would be irresponsible for us to begin to solicit money to create an acquisitions fund when we still have to grow enough to become more stable in the way that we serve the entire community, better in our planning long-term for exhibitions and publications, and to make sure that we continue to form a strong core group of staff who are committed long-term to the organization. It's tough enough to raise money to do those things, but on top of that, to raise money for acquisitions, I think right now would be a fool's errand. And I also think is that there's still so much work to be done with the collection that we currently have. And there are still so many pieces that have not been seen by our general public. So it becomes more a matter of priority. Now, big picture, long term, this institution deserves to have an acquisitions fund. When Andreas was selecting the works for the collection, he did his level best to have representations for all of the major figures across all media. So, for example, with Alberto Giacometti, painting, sculpture, drawings, prints, decorative arts, all the way across. We cannot say that for all of our major figures. For like Picasso, we do not have a Picasso painting. There was a Picasso painting in the family's collection, and that went to Andreas' sister. So there are, in my sense, if you imagine a grid of all of the major figures represented in the collection, and at the top of the grid, you went across all media, we still have holes in that grid that I would love to fill. And if we can't do it through gifts from donors, then at some point in the future, then we'll start to raise money for an acquisitions fund.
Have the more notable pieces within the collection already been displayed?
From a public perception of what constitutes notability, I would say yes. One could argue it's both a strength and a weakness here, and that is that we don't have a space that we can truly give over to show works long-term from the permanent collection. And so I mention that because it means that if somebody had missed an exhibition here, it means there's a good number of pieces they have never seen, because a lot of the pieces have only made one appearance, maybe two. So we have a lot of work to do to get the rest of the collection out in front of everybody.
John, how is your time divided as president of the Bechtler?
It's changed a lot over the last 8.5 years. In the beginning, even before we opened, obviously there was no staff to manage per se. It was more around board building and the execution of Mario Botta's design and fitting out the structure and imagining the financial basis for the organization and that initial wave of strategic planning, and then to build a team. Today, I'm lucky now that the number of direct reports has been reduced considerably, and now I only have 5 people reporting directly to me. And so that middle management part of our org chart has had the chance to mature considerably, and that allows me to spend more time with our board members, with our advisory council, with a lot of our donors, with our colleagues, and to continue to wrestle with what the strategic opportunities can and should be for the museum over the next 5 to 10 years. So I bet you 50% of my time is still managing, and I would say another 30% of my time is working with the board, and then the balance, it becomes idiosyncratic depending upon the week, working with colleagues, working on some of my own projects. And when I have the opportunity just to sit down and think, which is very often the hardest thing to do.
Well, what are you thinking about? What are you working through right now as the leader of the institution?
One of the biggest opportunities in front of us right now is the 10th anniversary. So just imagine January 2nd of 2020 being the beginning of a year's worth of celebration and reflection and activities meant to honor the ongoing gift of the family, to celebrate all of the work that we've been able to do with a wide variety of partners in this community, without whom, by the way, we couldn't have reached all of the different audiences we have been lucky enough to reach. But then how does that 10th year serve as the foundation for the next 10 years? That's really what my job is in so many ways. It's one thing to just get through week by week and even quarter by quarter or each fiscal year. All of those things are exceptionally important, but I'm rather uniquely charged with the challenge of figuring out what this institution is going to be and how it's going to serve the community 5 years, 10 years, even 25 years from now.
How do you imagine that it might be different?
Well, I can tell you how I'd like it to be different. There are a few areas. Anybody can look on a balance sheet on a 990. Our world, of course, is exceptionally transparent in that way, which I very much think is a good thing. Ours is an organization, a large part, because of its youth, does not have the kind of endowment that it really does need to attain and maintain the kind of financial strength that makes it easier for us to imagine what the next 3 to 5 years are going to look like with real confidence. So that's one thing. I imagine an organization on an even stronger financial footing, which has the kind of capital base that would allow us to experiment more ambitiously with programming, exhibitions, partnerships with other cultural institutions. The second element is that I just personally would love to see us do so much more in that community outreach template. There are a lot of audiences to whom we've had to say no. They've come to us and said, we'd love to work with you. You've heard so many good things about your work with the blind, with inmates, et cetera, and we'd love to find a way to create a partnership. And so I'm so often the bad guy because I'm the one that has to just say, listen, do we have the bandwidth to do this? And I'm also not particularly interested. I mean, we experiment with a lot of different things, but I'm not particularly interested in making commitments to a partner if I'm not sure that we're going to be able to do that thing for at least 2 or 3 years. Because it takes that much time to get all the bugs out and to really be able to look back and say what worked in the first year and what didn't, and how can we improve it in year 2, et cetera, et cetera. So I'd like to imagine that in the future we will have had the bandwidth developed that would allow us to do even more for all of those kind of non-traditional audiences who are not particularly well served by organizations like ours.
One core task of the museum is to curate and present its collection. What is the state of curation at the Bechtler, and how do you foresee it in the future?
Well, from the beginning, we've tried to mount exhibitions that draw attention to the core collection and those figures who, in the beginning of the museum's work, had the closest relationships with the family, because that was a big part of the story that we wanted to tell. And this goes back to your earlier question about the uniqueness of the Bechtler and the fact that it was formed by a single family. And so that has been our objective. And we've also shifted back and forth quite predictably between exhibitions that were based exclusively on works from our collection and then other exhibitions where we had borrowed from other institutions in order to provide a larger context for pieces within the collection. So when we did the Giacometti show back in 2012, we were lucky enough to get loans for 67 works by Giacometti from the Foundation in Paris and another half dozen from the Kunsthaus in Zurich. And when we did the big Niki de Saint-Phalle exhibition, we also were fortunate enough to get 49 pieces from the Niki Charitable Arts Foundation, which is her ongoing estate. So we've been doing it both ways, right? Both exclusively our collection, sometimes with major loans to provide that larger context. And over the past few years, we've been bringing more loans in a very focused way into certain exhibitions. Like the British Invasion show, we had a number of works by Lynn Chadwick, the British sculptor. And with the house that modernism built, we were able to rely on a strong relationship with the Herman Miller Corporation, and they lent the vast majority of things that came into the show. That's a pattern that's going to continue on a going forward basis with an increased emphasis on the mid-century strengths of the institution and its legacy with the family as collectors.
For many years, you led the curatorial efforts. How do you see your staffing around that work going forward?
Well, the balance has always been an appropriate one. And today, we're posting that curatorial position again on a national basis in the way that we did 3 years ago. And I'm sure that because of the strengths of Charlotte and the museum itself and our collection, we'll bring somebody very strong into that position.
What makes modern art modern art?
That's a very big question. And we could spend an entire academic term, trying to sort that out. It operates on any number of levels. And there are going to be a lot of different definitions of what constitutes modernism. Is it merely the fact that a work was produced during a particular window of time? In other words, is it driven purely by chronology? And when did modernism start and when did it end, if it ever ended? The ancillary question is, what's the difference between modern and contemporary art? And academics continue to argue over that, and they always will. But if we're talking about modern art with a capital M, sort of late 19th, early 20th century, right up through the 1960s and 70s. And some would argue that the arrival of pop was the birth of the contemporary movement with a capital C. By the way, all modern art at one point or another was contemporary. So this is where it sort of begs the value of the question, just to begin with. But insofar as modern art aggressively took the reins in trying to free itself from certain expectations like simple verisimilitude, that is to say, that it can only be art if it somehow represents or recreates in a convincing fashion things as we see them around us. And that, of course, became unhinged for a number of reasons, not the least of which was the birth of photography, which got everybody to question, okay, well, if photography is an art, or even if it isn't it far superior in its abilities of verisimilitude? The answer would be yes, in many ways. But then eventually, even photographers who wanted to become art photographers, like the early work of Steichen, he, of course, manipulated his photographic images considerably because there was a sense at that time that a pure, straightforward, simple photograph was not art unless you did something to it. Well, on a parallel track, for all of those painters and sculptors who began to beg the question as well, they were trying to recreate the phenomenon of sight, hence the birth of the Impressionist, right? It's not the exact molecular representation of people sitting on a beach. It's more this impressionistic, post-impressionistic attempt to recreate the stimulus, the excitement of vision and light in the open air. And then when you shovel into all of those inquiries, dramatic changes politically, governmentally, in other arts, with science in particular, humor, injecting humor into what constitutes true art, hence the Dada movement, modern art becomes this ambitious, complicated, delightful mess of competing approaches and sometimes infinitely varied approaches at some new form of expression that is not necessarily defined only by the success of its verisimilitude.
John, I'd like to read you a quote that comes from a paper entitled Modern Art and the Concept of Decline. The ordinary contemporary person is generally uncomfortable with modern art. Its fragmented, abstract quality leaves the viewer baffled and often irritated. The content and form of modern art is radically different from the traditional concepts of art. In the popular contemporary mind, modern art is considered brutal, nihilistic, and unnecessarily provocative, neither beautiful nor true. What would be your response to that?
I can see why somebody might say that. I don't know that it's entirely true. I think it's always hard to identify who that average person is, especially when it comes to their engagement with modern art. And whether that modern art is Jackson Pollock or Norman Rockwell is another thing yet to sort out. You're right. I think one of the bigger questions is more around abstraction. The challenge of abstraction in art is such that there seems to be so little for the average viewer to hold on to. Where do I start this examination? I'm looking at a painting. Isn't it supposed to look like something? And to help those viewers, those museum goers, those students, begin to get comfortable with what Paul Seruzier said, one of the great symbolist painters, a member of the Nabi group back in the 1890s, that a painting starts out first is that it's colors on a flat surface, a two-dimensional surface. That's how every painting starts out, right? And if you allow yourself to go back to that, it can be quite liberating, right? Not every painting, and we're just focusing on painting for now, not sculpture or other forms, has to be a successful rendering of some window onto another space that is populated with objects or people or landscapes. Sometimes the surface of the painting and what's happening right there before your eyes can be the most arresting and compelling of all of the artworks, if one feels comfortable with that. So I would argue a few things. It'd be easier to make a case that the nature of academia's relationship to modern art, as well as the world of critics and, a longer standing tradition of curators, very likely unintentionally, but perhaps intentionally, made it so hard for the average person to become comfortable with these works. It's almost like a corollary to the old saying, if you have to ask what it costs, you can't afford it. The statement here would be, listen, if we have to explain it to you, you'll never understand it. So on one level, I really kind of blame the industry, as it were, the gallery, museum, academic industry, that in their pursuit for the more deep and arcane explanations and mysteries of these pieces, they just seem to leave everybody else behind.
How do you overcome that curatorial challenge of presenting and explaining modern art?
And that is the core of what we do. I mean, it really is. The art's value is not only because it exists, but because it is seen, right? So if you have a gold bar in your safe and you never use it and you can't use it as capital or collateral, then it has no value, right? So to have our work be understood, one of the first things we try to do is have people comfortable with ambiguity and that they don't have to know everything immediately. In fact, I would argue that if you think you know everything immediately, you don't know anything immediately. So we encourage people to make return trips. In the same way that, if you fall in love with a film, you're not only going to watch it once and say, gee, wasn't that great? Or if you have a favorite poem, or everybody on their iPod, they've got a workout set, or they've got their favorite love songs, wherever it is, they'll listen to them over and over and over again. And every so often, if they're lucky, they'll hear something new in that piece. Or maybe because of the day they just had, there was a breakup, or the best news ever, or somebody had a baby, whatever it was, suddenly that song has new meaning. It is no different with the visual arts. I would argue that we return to these works over and over again. And every time, if we're open to it, and if we're comfortable with ambiguity, and if we're confident enough, because it's a completely shameless enterprise, then you're always going to be rewarded more deeply the more you come back and come back.
Is there a particular work in the Bechtler collection that profoundly interests you?
There is. Of course, there's more than one, but to be disciplined today, I'll talk about one in particular, and that's Spiral Logarithms, a painting by Le Corbusier. It's from 1928 to 31. It turns out, and we didn't know this until just about 3 or 4 years ago, it was a painting not known by the Academy because the co-authors of the catalogue raisonné of Corbusier's paintings came to us in a panic as they were about to launch the second edition of that catalogue because they had no idea this painting existed. And so they very much wanted to have a digital image so it could be included. That's always kind of thrilling in its own way because you suddenly recognize that the institution's existence and the gift of the Bechtlers now allows this piece to be better known. And by extension, therefore, people get to understand Corbusier that much better as a painter. Why the years 1920 to 31 are so important is because that's exactly the moment when Corbusier is designing what I feel was his masterpiece of residential architecture, the great Villa Savoy in the outskirts of Paris. When you think about Frank Lloyd Wright and you think about Falling Water, in many ways this was Corbusier's Falling Water. Widely known, widely photographed, hugely influential, a very important building. And there are elements in the painting that reflect directly in terms of what he was doing with that particular house. The color scheme on the interiors are these wonderful muted pastels, which we didn't know about until a recent restoration about 15 years ago, because all the earlier photographs were in black and white. World War II arrived on the outskirts of Paris, and the building was almost totally destroyed both by German soldiers and then by American soldiers. And so when it was restored, the whole thing was painted white. Only recently, after the analysis of the many layers of paint, getting back to the original with gas chromatographic studies to really get the pigment basis. The interior walls are the same colors as you see in this painting. The abstracted outline of the human figure shown in the center of the painting, that outline echoes the floor plans of the house itself as you're looking at it. But one of the most important elements, I think, is that up at the top, in the upper left-hand corner, is a small nautilus shell, which for anybody who's familiar with it is one of the archetypal representations of the Fibonacci number sequence. Corbusier was obsessed with the Fibonacci notion and the whole golden mean and the golden section. And when you look at his books, the most seminal of which, of course, is Towards an Architecture, in this country translated to Towards a New Architecture, he has photographs in the book, these terrible grainy photographs of Chartres Cathedral and some of his own buildings and ocean liners and grain silos where the Fibonacci series is superimposed on those, as if to say, if you love the shape of these objects, it's because they are somehow perfect. And so there's this constant exploration on his part in terms of understanding the Fibonacci number sequence and its application. And so that all of those different levels make that painting very intriguing to me.
John, you've had many accomplishments, and you've had more than one career, and you have careers in parallel. I'd like to talk about your life and how you've come to this point. I understand you're a fourth-generation Californian.
Proudly.
What are those California roots?
Well, they go back on my mother's side. We're very Irish. We're still trying to figure out where the name Boyer came from, but I can tell you the other three grandparents are Lenehan, McGillicuddy, and Keneally. And for whatever constellation of reasons, the McGillicuddy and the Keneally side went to California back in the late 1870s to what eventually became Manhattan Beach. On my father's side, they came out there only in the 1920s. My mom and dad met in high school in Los Angeles and fell in love and produced yours truly and my older brother Michael. And all of that took place in Los Angeles. And because both sides of the family were kind of romantic in terms of their engagement with California, that's the world in which I grew up. And that it was always this golden and beautiful landscape that was choked with opportunity for everybody who was moving westward, whether it was in the 19th century or in the Dust Bowl decades. I was lucky that the California that I thought that I knew as a boy was eternally optimistic and filled with this kind of joyful beauty. I mean, that's really how I remember it. You're lucky if you're a kid, if that's the way you think of where you were raised. And, eventually I was raised in the desert. And so that's woven into me quite completely a great love for the desert landscape and the way of life and the fragility of the seasons and its awesome stillness. I mean, I miss it every day, I have to say. So yeah, we could never move back. California is so different now than it was when I was a boy, like every other place, of course. Still so many strengths, the 8th largest economy, not the least of them. But more importantly, a more sobering kind of nostalgia, I think, has emerged in California over the last couple of decades. And I think that it's served that state very well, that there's a franker acceptance of its history and its complexity, which should still not erode the kind of longing and nostalgia at its best.
Do you think of yourself as a Californian?
I do, and I don't even know how to put a handle on that. Maybe it's because I was too old when we finally moved to the East, despite having lived for 20 years in Connecticut, a place that we still love. But yeah, I guess down deep, I still think of myself as a desert kid or in the Sierra Nevadas or in the Pacific.
What was formative about your childhood?
Two things, I guess. One was the rigor and the ceremony of Catholicism. Went to Catholic school, elementary Catholic school, wanted to become a priest. until 8th grade when I discovered girls in the profoundest way, and that was the end of that. So, but I always loved the ceremony, the music, the calm, the sincerity as I understood it as a kid that I was lucky enough to experience as a boy. The other thing for me was just the natural setting. Growing up in the town that I did, if you look to the east, it was desert as far as the eye could see, and you turn around and you're suddenly staring at a mountain that is just under 11,000 feet high. And that is a rare opportunity to have such a dramatically varied topography to engage as a kid and then as a young man, horseback riding and hiking and mountain climbing and backpacking. And so I would say that the natural setting did a great deal to inform me. I mean, still.
John, you went to the University of California at Santa Barbara. What did you study?
I studied art history.
What were your ambitions?
To be a college professor. God help me. And I was lucky enough, I got to study with one fellow, Fikret Yeğul, Turkish-born and raised, got an architecture degree at Penn under Louis Kahn, got his PhD from Harvard in Roman archaeology, and he was really formal. You can imagine how wonderfully tough-minded Fikret was. But my advisor, David Gebhardt, was this kind of freewheeling, wonderful modernist from the Midwest, and so I had the best of both worlds during my years there, and they were great influences on me.
From there, you went to Princeton University. Mm-hmm. What did your thesis work explore?
It explored the influence of the architecture at Oxford and Cambridge universities on late 19th and early 20th century American university design, not only from the formal characteristics of the collegiate Gothic, and that's what I focused on, but also the entire college system, where the students lived, how they lived in proximity to their professors, and how that was based on an English model that was very much embraced by, of all people, Woodrow Wilson when he was president of Princeton University. So I looked at Princeton, Yale, the University of Chicago, and Bryn Mawr to make sure that I also had the experience of what was happening with a women's institution during those same years.
John, you then went into education, as you mentioned, teaching at Trinity College in Connecticut and lecturing, Columbia, Brown. What do you remember about those days?
Well, I miss teaching a great deal. What I remember was, in my innocence, the thrill of going into a room, darkened, and projecting up on the wall images of buildings and artwork that had profoundly affected me, that changed my life. And I still haven't lost that sense of enthusiasm. And I would turn to the class and expect them to all be just as enthusiastic. And, you're lucky every so often, and sometimes you get a few students who are. But the very notion that you have the opportunity and responsibility to introduce, and probably for the first time, to all of these young, smart people, works that are so important and can enhance the way they see the world around them, and eventually, if they're committed, the way they understand themselves, that is a great honor, and I miss it.
You could be a professor at a liberal arts college or at an Ivy League university. You made a decision not to stay on that track. What happened?
Well, as much as I loved my time teaching at Trinity, which I very much did, it was sort of one of the last vestiges of those 4-year liberal arts colleges where it was more insular than open. That's changed considerably at Trinity, as it has at many other institutions. And so I was approached, I wasn't looking, but I was approached by a member of the board's search committee for a museum opening for a director, and that turned out to be the Mark Twain House. And I was intrigued. I've always loved Twain. But what I had also come to understand about Twain was the importance of his voice around issues that meant a great deal and still mean a great deal to me, especially about race and prejudice, about freedom of speech and expression, and the power of language to move the world, to cause revolutions, to bring peace. Oh, and by the way, this spectacular late 19th century house that he commissioned with the only domestic interiors remaining by Louis Comfort Tiffany, an associated artist. I was convinced by the search committee that they were ready to deal with the race issue, and that if you are going to truly serve as a steward for Twain's legacy, you have to be able to deal with the N-word. It's the conversation starter. It's too often the conversation stopper. But if we were ready to do that, then I was their guy, and that's what we did for 16 years.
So, John, here you are, a professor of modern art and architecture, now the executive director of the Mark Twain House. Is there a connection in your mind between Mark Twain and modern art?
Absolutely. I think that I don't really agree with all that much anymore of what Ernest Hemingway said, but I do agree with one thing, and that is that all modern American literature started with one work, and that was Huckleberry Finn. And the reason that I agree is that it was one of the first pieces, but certainly the most important early piece of literature that spoke of the real voice. It was an authentic voice. Not only Huck's, but Jim's and all the other characters were quite candid and transparent and informative and inspiring, each in their own way. And so when I think about modern art, I think that modern art at its best has always been a rush to authenticity and to innovation, to find your own authentic voice as a visual artist and to not necessarily be overwhelmed by the dictates from the academy. Yes, you have mentors and certainly you're their influences, but in the end, it's more that urge to discover who you are as an artist, and you take all the risks necessary to get there. And that very much encapsulated Twain's life too.
John, you've had a parallel career in managing investment funds. What is that work?
Well, I do not manage investment funds. I serve on the board of a family of mutual funds. So if we go back to the 1940 Act, the SEC's 1940 Act, where mutual funds boards were created to serve as the representatives for all the shareholders of today's mutual funds and exchange-traded funds, ETFs, and all the rest. And we serve as that arbiter, as it were, between the advisor, the investment company, in this case Voya, and previously for me ING and Aetna Financial Services, and the shareholders. So our job is we monitor performance, we set fees, we hire and fire the managers, and we're responsible to make certain that the appropriate structure for compliance for all laws are in place and being enforced. That's what we do. And I've been fortunate enough to serve the shareholders now for, it's coming up on 21 years. So I figured out long ago how to do this balance. I'm not a hobby guy. I don't mean to sound glib, but I don't dedicate a lot of time. I'm not the kind of guy who's going to lose 3/4 of a Saturday playing golf. I love the game, love to watch it, but that's not how I'm built. When this opportunity was presented to me, I didn't seek it out. It was presented to me by then the CEO of the Aetna, who asked me if I would sit on a board for a small family of funds that they were just then launching for what's referred to as the 403B market. That's really for the sort of nonprofit academia, cultural, and hospitals. And he said, and what I want to make sure we always have at the table is somebody who truly represents the end user. So, as a museum director, very often you serve as the plan advisor, the plan sponsor for our 401k, which is what we have here, and 403Bs earlier. So I've always had to pay attention and encourage our staff, especially our younger staff, to participate in a matching plan, which we have here at the Bechtler. And so Dick Huber was his name. Dick wanted to make sure that there was always somebody at the table asking the basic questions on behalf of the shareholder. And the next thing you know, it's almost 21 years later, and it's $100 billion, and I'm currently the chair of the board. So go figure.
How does your career in the arts and overseeing investment funds inform each other? Well,
on one hand, both of them serve well the old statement by the great architect Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, and that was that God is in the details. So not the devil, but God is in the details. And in both instances, both in the realm of fine arts and in the realm of finance, the details are everything. Yeah, you need the big picture and all that stuff is true, but the larger apparatus cannot be sustained unless the details are working. And I've always been fascinated by the kind of inner workings of things. And so there's much more of a parallel between, there's more of a relationship between those two worlds in my life than you might think. The other is that in both instances for me, in running a museum and overseeing a collection that's owned by the entire community and trying to figure out the best way to serve that community, that's not very much unlike what we do on the mutual fund board. We are there to represent that small mom and pop business and their investments in their mutual funds for the retirement program or for the young family or for the senior. And so I take that part most seriously. And so in both instances, that's really the same, right? How can you find different ways to serve your local community, but the larger community? And I'm just blessed to have both of those chances to do so.
John, finally, in remarks you gave to the Charlotte Rotary, you spoke about true art. What is true art to you?
True art to me is the manifestation of an individual's deepest expression without any concern for market or fame. That the work itself becomes infinitely more important than the individual who produces it.
What is your true art?
To the degree I have one, I would say that it is a passion to do all that I can well to connect our community with some higher form of their lives. And I was convinced long ago that I was likely best suited to use art as the principal instrument in that enterprise. So my true art is just the commitment that I have to make people's lives better through their engagement with the arts.
Thank you for your time today, John.
Thank you, Mark.
John Boyer is president and CEO of the Bechtler Museum of Modern Art. He earned a BA in art history from the University of California at Santa Barbara and an M.F.A. in the history of modern art from Princeton University. And now, a personal word. John Boyer is a teacher at heart. He lights up a room when he tells stories about works of art and the artists who created them. His narrations are referenced and precise. He shares what he knows because he wants us to know it too. When we listen to him, we can imagine being in a classroom with lights low as he projects images of paintings and buildings and modern design at a screen. Better yet, we don't have to imagine him and the art at all when we witness him gesturing to the real thing. He is thrilled at what he sees and thrilled when we marvel with him. John defined true art as the manifestation of a person's deepest expression, with the work being more important than the person who produced it. He talked about how in such efforts, God is in the details. He said his true art is a passion to make our lives better through engagement with the arts. He has done that as a college professor of art history, as director of the Mark Twain House, and now leading the Bechtler Museum of Modern Art. He is living his deepest expression, attending to the details. Asking John about his true art leads me to ask myself the same question. What is my true art? What is my deepest expression where I find God in the details? The answer is in the question, in posing the question. My deepest expression where I find God, if there is a God, and if God is to be found, is asking questions about life and meaning. I was at a dinner the other night, hosted by a friend. My friend is a leadership performance strategist who helps athletes and executives break through to higher levels of achievement. He hosts dinners in which he invites many guests into conversation. The conversation turned to who we are at our best. A guest at the table made this remark: the secret ingredient to being in an ideal performance state is love. If we do what we love and love what we do, we attend to the details with such effort that the product of our love appears to manifest effortlessly. Here are things I love. I love being in conversation with someone who intrigues me. I love asking them questions, getting to know them, going deep quickly with them about what matters most to them, creating a bond that is outside of time in the moment. I love expressing something essential about the person I met, intuiting who they are and helping tell their deepest story. I love creating portraits of people, using words. I love creating a record of these encounters, creating an archive of their values and my own, preserving something I hope is beautiful and true for others to discover. Of course, what I am describing is this project, this podcast, the people I am meeting, the conversations I am having, the thoughts I am sharing, the episodes I am producing, the platform I am presenting. The details consume me. It is a labor of love. The current exhibit at the Bechtler Museum of Modern Art is called Wrestling the Angel. The exhibit examines how religion and sacred art appear in work made by seemingly secular avant-garde artists. The exhibit is largely the vision of Jen Edwards, a curator and artist in her own right. I see in the work artists expressing God in the details, not knowing whether God exists. I see in the work an assertion that life is divine in an indifferent universe. I see myself in the work wrestling with questions and answers about the human condition. John Boyer makes it possible for us to marvel. He presents us with works of art that are labors of love. He does what all good teachers do. He invites us to encounter ourselves. This is Mark Paris, and you've been listening to On Life and Meaning. Additional support for this podcast is provided by the UNC College of Arts and Architecture, celebrating a decade of creative education in the arts and design. Thank you to our funding partners, and to my teammates, Andy Go, producer of the show, and to Chris Curriton, art and media director. This is how you can help. Please write a review on iTunes. It helps us grow our audience. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter. We'd love to hear what you think about the show. And become a patron. We are on Patreon, a crowdsourcing platform that allows you to support what you value at a level you choose. Visit us also on our website on lifeandmeaning.com. Thank you for listening.